Now let's have a look at what Sunday's newspapers have to say. We're joined by lecturer David Smith from the University of Sydney. David, good to see you this morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, no surprise that the MH17 tragedy still dominates the headlines. And again today we have a couple of papers, the Sun Herald and the Sunday Telegraph out of New South Wales. So what are they telling us?
Well, what they're telling us is about the debate over whether the Australian personnel who are going to Russia to help secure the site and investigate should be armed. So there are about 190 federal police going, and there'll be some Defence Force personnel as well.
We're just having a look there at that Telegraph story.
Yes.
Obviously about, as you're discussing, that crash site.
That's right, because people are now able to get there. It's taken a long time for people from outside of the region to be able to go in, and so now investigators can go in. But there's a debate over whether it'll be a provocation to send armed police there. Other countries aren't sending armed police or Defence Force personnel. But Australia's in a unique position of being a non-NATO country, so a country that Russia doesn't necessarily see as a threat. But there are still warnings that because this is an unstable region, a volatile region held by rebels who it's very unclear who is leading them, who's in control, that sending armed personnel there could potentially be dangerous.
Yeah, well, we heard that earlier, Eliza, with your interview, that it's largely an autonomous region.
That's right.
Controlled by those rebels. So if the Australians walk in there, but it's unclear exactly how they will be armed.
Yes.
And who will be armed, because along with the police there will also be a number of army personnel, but we're not sure if they'll in fact be soldiers or not.
That's right, and I'm sure that every effort will be made to do this in the least provocative way possible. And there's been a lot of diplomacy with Russia in the lead up to this to ensure that this is not seen by Russia as a provocation. But it's not just Russia that Australia is dealing with at the point. It's rebels who have just brought down a plane. And the fact that they did that in the first place really shows how unstable and volatile the situation is.
All right, let's move on to another big story that we've been covering for weeks now in Gaza. There was that temporary truce, and yet things have started again and more people are dying.
Yes, and so the truce only lasted, I think, 8 hours tonight before Hamas fired more rockets at Tel Aviv.
In fact, the Israelis did extend it, but Hamas said they were not following that. So, but yes, hostilities have resumed.
That's right. And the last time there was a temporary ceasefire on July 17th, Israel used the time to prepare a ground attack in Gaza. So this is why Hamas didn't want to extend the truce any further this time. What we're seeing is both sides believe they are acting in self-defense. And a lot of the terrible things that happen in this conflict happen because of the strategic dilemma that both sides face. Israel doesn't want a Hamas government in Gaza. It wants to get rid of the network of tunnels, which it says can lead to terror attacks, and rockets. However, it's very difficult for Israel to do this without inflicting massive casualties on the Palestinian population, because Gaza is the most densely populated area on earth. So the Palestinians are experiencing what they see as collective punishment.
David, do you feel as though the reporting out of Gaza at the moment is making a difference? Unlike previous conflicts we've seen there, the access and level of reporting has been quite extensive, hasn't it?
It has been unusually extensive. In fact, this has posed really serious problems for some US news networks where reporters have been reporting on things that have been highly controversial in the United States. There was a reporter from NBC pulled out of Gaza after reporting on an attack on a Gaza beach that killed 4 Palestinian children. So we are seeing much higher levels of access currently than we have seen before. I don't know how much that's actually making a difference.
David, I'd like to move on to another story that you've been looking at recently. You wrote a piece for The Drum on the ABC about how America is dealing with its own asylum seeker crisis. We've been discussing it thoroughly here in Australia. Tell us a bit about what's occurring over there.
So there have been nearly 60,000 unaccompanied children from Central America, from Guatemala, Honduras and El Salvador, who have crossed the border into the United States since October. This is a much higher number than the US has ever seen before. It's higher than the immigration system can deal with. And what these children are fleeing mainly is lawlessness in Central America. They're fleeing regions where state authority has collapsed and drug gangs are in control. Now, Barack Obama's response to this has actually been, surprisingly, to try to repeal laws that prevent the deportation of children. So he actually wants these children deported back to Central America far more quickly to try to deter them from coming in the first place. And it's the same logic that we saw both the Labor and Liberal parties use when Australia faced its own asylum seeker crises.
And indeed, do they have a legal claim for asylum in the United States?
This is a very tricky issue because there's not a war going on there, but there's a homicide rate that is higher than war zone combat death rate. So a lot of the children who come are eventually granted asylum under the law that currently prevents them from being deported immediately because they've come from such horrifically violent situations. But it's unpopular in the United States to grant asylum to children who a lot of Americans see they're just fleeing poverty or they're just fleeing bad neighbourhoods. But what they're really fleeing is unimaginable levels of violence.
David Smith, great to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.